The pressure on my wrist wasn't painful yet, but the threat was unmistakable. Commander Rick Halloway, a man my mother swore was a perfect gentleman, was leaning across the white tablecloth with a smile that didn't reach his dead, shark-like eyes. The expensive ambiance of the restaurant, the soft jazz, the crystal glass winking, in the candlelight, suddenly felt suffocating, closing in around us like a trap. He leaned in closer, his cologne thick and cloying in the air between us. "You're a civilian, sweetie," he purred, his grip tightening just enough to turn his knuckles white. "You don't understand chain of command. In this marriage, I lead. You follow?" I didn't pull away. I didn't gasp. A familiar coldness settled in my stomach, the heavy, tired weight of a truth being confirmed. Instead of trembling, I reached into my clutch with my free hand and slid a matte black leather wallet across the tablecloth. With a casual flick of my thumb, I flipped it open. It wasn't a dependent ID. It was my Department of Defense Senior Executive Service credential, the holographic Level 5 Eagle seal catching the light, a symbol of authority that technically placed me 3 pay grades above him. I leaned in, matching his intensity, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "You're right, Rick, rank matters. That's why you're going to let go of my wrist, stand up, and salute." "Right. Now." He froze. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint right there in the booth. He stared at that badge, then back at me, then back at the badge. He looked at it like it was written in alien hieroglyphics. To understand why a seasoned Navy commander couldn't recognize that he was currently assaulting his own boss, you have to understand the lie my mother, Carol, had been telling him and herself for over 10 years. My mother, Carol, was a woman who treated military rank like a religion she didn't actually understand. To her, the uniform was everything. The brass buttons, the prestige, the social hierarchy, but she was completely blind to the actual mechanics of power. For a decade, I had been working as a director of intelligence, managing assets and authorizing operations that could topple governments. But to Carol, I was a senior analyst. In her mind, that was just polite code for overpaid secretary with a security clearance. She assumed I spent my days filing paperwork and fetching coffee for the real heroes, men like Rick. She couldn't conceive of a world where her quiet single daughter was the one giving the orders. So, when she cornered me last Sunday, her eyes wide with manic excitement, I knew exactly what was coming. "He's a commander, honey," she practically shrieked, shoving a blurry photo of a man in dress whites into my face. "He commands a destroyer. Do you know what that means?" I did actually better than she did, but I stayed silent. "He needs a wife who can host dinners and look good on his arm," she continued, her voice dripping, with that specific brand of motherly criticism that sounds like advice but feels like an insult. "Not a spinster buried in spreadsheets. You need someone to take care of you." That stung, the casual way she reduced my entire career to spreadsheets. She looked at me with that familiar mix of pity and disappointment, treating me like a broken appliance she was trying to pawn off. I looked at her desperation, and I realized it was easier to endure one boring meal of dry chicken and male ego than to listen to another month of her guilt trips. "Fine," I sighed, the defeat tasting bitter on my tongue. "One dinner. But if he's a jerk, I'm leaving." I didn't know I was walking into a war zone. Before I could even leave the house for this disaster of a date, I had to survive the pre-mission briefing, conducted by my mother in the hallway. She was picking lint off my blazer with the aggressive focus of a drill sergeant, her face pinched with worry. It wasn't worry for my safety, of course, it was worry that I would embarrass her by being myself. She tugged at my collar, sighing as if my very existence was a fashion faux pas she had to correct. "Now listen to me," she said, her voice dropping to that conspiratorial whisper she used when discussing my deficiencies. "Don't talk about your work, okay? Nobody wants to hear about whatever it is you do. It's boring, honey, it's unladylike." I stood there, stiff as a board, letting her fuss over me like I was a prop in her social play. In her mind, my career was a cute little placeholder, a way to pay the bills until a husband came along to give my life actual meaning. She called it data entry for the Navy. To her, I was just a glorified typist in a windowless room, probably entering payroll codes or organizing supply manifests. Rick is a commander, she reminded me for the 10th time, her eyes shining with the reflection of his rank. He commands a destroyer. That is a real job. Men like him, they like to lead. So just ask him about his ship and smile. Let him be the hero. I nodded, biting my tongue so hard I tasted copper. I didn't tell her that if I actually talked about my day, I'd be arrested for treason. Because 12 hours before she told me to let the man lead, I was the only person in the room allowed to speak. I was standing inside the cage, our sensitive compartmented information facility, buried 3 floors beneath the earth where cell signals go to die. The air inside is always recycled, cold, and smells faintly of ozone and high-stress sweat. There were no windows, just walls of monitors and the low, anxious hum of cooling fans keeping the servers alive. I wasn't fetching coffee or filing paperwork. I was standing at the head of the main tactical table, staring down a room full of full-bird colonels and a representative from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They weren't looking at their phones or chatting, they were looking at me, waiting for my call on the threat matrix that had just lit up the eastern seaboard like a Christmas tree. The SIGINT packages from the listening post in heavy rotation confirm. Movement in Sector 4, I said, my voice cutting through the silence. I didn't ask for permission. I tapped the glass screen, bringing up a live feed that most generals never get to see. I'm initiating an override protocol. We are retasking the KH-11 satellite array immediately. I want eyes on that convoy before it crosses the border. A colonel tried to interrupt, mentioning budget constraints on satellite fuel. I didn't even look up from the screen. This is originator control material, Colonel. The budget is irrelevant when the asset is this volatile. Unless you want to explain to the White House why we lost visibility, you will retask that bird now. He sat down. He didn't argue. He knew that even though I wasn't wearing a uniform, my SES-2 rank, Senior Executive, Service Level 2, made me the civilian equivalent of a Rear Admiral. In this room, I outranked every single officer in uniform. It's a strange, disjointed feeling, holding that kind of invisible weight while your mother critiques your lipstick. My mother sees a daughter who can't find a husband. The Joint Chiefs see an analyst who predicts wars before they start. I wasn't taking notes that day. I was deciding where the U.S. Navy would position its fleet for the next month. I was moving chess pieces that cost billions of dollars and housed thousands of souls. I authorized a drone surveillance grid with a biometric key that only 3 people on the eastern seaboard possess. When I speak in that room, the pen scratching on paper stops, because everyone knows my analysis becomes policy. That is my reality, a world of absolute consequence, where a single hesitation can cost lives. And that brings us to the profound, almost comedic irony of Commander Rick Halloway. Rick is what we call a surface warfare officer, or SWO. He lives in a world of steel and gunpowder, of visible might and loud engines. To men like Rick, the intelligence community is just a bunch of nerds in a basement. Administrative hurdles he has to jump over to get to the real fight. He views civilian intel officers, especially women, as irrelevant obstacles, paper pushers who don't understand the grit of the sea. He has no idea how the system actually works. He sits on his bridge, waiting for targeting packages, a dossier that tells him where the bad guys are and when he's allowed to fire. He thinks those packages come from some abstract command. He doesn't realize that command is often a 34-year-old woman in a cardigan who just spent 10 hours analyzing thermal signatures. The very coordinates he steers his ship toward, I picked them. The rules of engagement he has to memorize, I wrote them. He thinks he's the predator, the shark in the water. He doesn't understand that without me, he is blind, deaf, and swimming in circles. Rick walked into that restaurant thinking he was interviewing a candidate for the position of Navy wife. He didn't realize he was sitting across from the architect of his next deployment. Rick didn't salute. He laughed. A wet, condescending sound that made my skin crawl. He looked at the SES credential lying on the table, then back at me, shaking his head with a smirk that was equal parts arrogance and pity. Cute, he sneered, leaning back in his chair. Did the gift shop make that for you? Look, I know you government girls like to feel important, but let's be real. He scanned me up and down, his eyes lingering with an insulting familiarity. "You're too uptight. That's your problem. You need a man to loosen you up, not a fake badge." Then came the squeeze. His fingers dug into my wrist again, harder this time, not romantic, but possessive. A warning. In that split second, the bad date ended, and a professional evaluation began. I stopped seeing a potential suitor and started seeing a liability. I watched his pupils dilate, the vein throbbing in his neck, the casual willingness to use force when his ego was threatened. This man commands a warship? I thought, the cold logic of my training taking over. He holds the codes to weapons systems? He wasn't just a jerk, he was volatile. He was unfit for command. This was no longer a social interaction, it was a counterintelligence risk assessment. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my drink. I simply pulled my hand away with a sharp, practiced twist that broke his grip instantly. I snapped the wallet shut, the sound cracking like a gunshot in the quiet restaurant. I stood up, smoothing my dress with deliberate, terrifying calm. "Check your email at 0800, Commander," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth. "You have a readiness audit?" I turned on my heel and walked out, leaving him alone with his confusion, and the bill. The moment I stepped into the cool night air, I pulled out my secure phone. My fingers flew across the encrypted keypad as I dialed a direct line. "Admiral Vance," I said when he picked up. Vance, my mentor and the only man who knew exactly how dangerous I could be, didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Go ahead, Director." "Sir, I need to flag a file," I said, watching the city lights blur past the window of my Uber. "Commander Richard Holloway. I'm initiating a formal fitness for duty review regarding his security clearance level. And sir, I want to deliver the news personally." I knew exactly what I was doing. A police report would have been a messy he said, she said affair, easily dismissed by his rank and connections. But a clearance review? That was fatal. I was filing a clearance adjudication review based on erratic behavior and disregard for superior authority. It was administrative, it was bureaucratic, and it was absolutely bulletproof. He thought I walked away because I was scared. He didn't know I was just heading to the office to officially end his career. At 0800 hours, the conference room at Naval Headquarters is usually a sanctuary of quiet, grim discipline. But not this morning. Even through the heavy oak doors, I could hear Commander Rick Holloway holding court. He was leaning back in a leather chair, regaling a nervous junior officer with the hilarious tale of his disaster date, his voice carrying that booming, unearned confidence that mediocre men wear like armor. "I'm telling you, she was delusional," he laughed, the sound grating against my nerves like sandpaper. "Some secretary who thinks she's a spy because she has a laminate badge. She actually tried to give me orders, can you imagine?" He chuckled, shaking his head at the absurdity of a woman demanding respect. "I dodged a bullet, kid. Crazy chicks are the worst." I waited for the laughter to die down before nodding to the Master Chief standing guard. The chief threw the door open and his voice cracked like a whip, instantly sucking the oxygen out of the room. "Room. Attention." Rick scrambled out of his chair, his instincts taking over. He straightened his tie, smoothed his dress whites, and locked his eyes forward, expecting an admiral to stride in. He was ready to charm, ready to salute, ready to play the good soldier. He wasn't ready for me. I walked in first. I wasn't wearing the soft, approachable dress from the restaurant. I was wearing a charcoal business suit, sharp enough to cut glass, and my hair was pulled back in a severe no-nonsense bun. But the loudest thing in the room wasn't my heels clicking on the tile, it was the lanyard swinging from my neck. It held the Navy Yard green badge, the highest tier of unescorted access. And right next to it, glinting under the fluorescent lights, was the gold lapel pin of the Senior Executive Service. I didn't look at him. I walked straight to the head of the mahogany table and placed my folder down with a heavy, deliberate thud. Then, Admiral Vance walked in, behind me. He didn't take the head of the table. He took the seat to my left. In the silent, rigid language of military protocol that screamed one thing louder than any shout could, I was the lead. I was the principal. And the Admiral was just here to witness the execution. Rick froze. His eyes darted from me to the Admiral, his brain short-circuiting as it tried to reconcile the secretary from dinner with the woman currently occupying the seat of power. He broke protocol, his voice trembling with a desperate need to correct reality. "Sir," he stammered, looking past me to address Vance. "Sir, there must be a mistake. She shouldn't be in here. This is a classified briefing." Admiral Vance didn't even blink. He looked at Rick with a cold, stone-faced boredom that was terrifying to behold. "Commander," Vance said, his voice low and dangerous. "You are addressing Director Holloway. Excuse me, Director last name, the head of Asymmetric Warfare Intelligence. You will speak when spoken to." The silence that followed was absolute. Rick's mouth snapped shut. He looked at me, and for the first time, he really saw me. He saw the cold calculation in my eyes, the same look I had given him when he squeezed my wrist. I opened the folder. I didn't scream. I didn't mention the restaurant, the insults, or the bill he stuck me with. I didn't have to. I simply dissected his professional existence. "Commander," I began, my voice steady and devoid of emotion, "I've been reviewing your operational history. You have a pattern of disregarding intel reports that originate from civilian analysts. You missed 3 critical protocol updates in the last quarter alone." I looked up, catching his gaze. "You seem to believe that rank protects you from competence." He started to sweat, a visible sheen appearing on his forehead. "Director, I can explain." "I'm not asking for an explanation," I interrupted, flipping the page. "I'm making a finding." I closed the folder. This was the moment. I thought of my mother, telling me to let him lead. I thought of every time a man had interrupted me in a meeting. And then I looked at the man who thought he could control me with a squeeze of his hand. "Commander, your psychological profile suggests a struggle with authority specifically. When that authority challenges your ego," I said, leaning forward just slightly, "given your performance last night, I cannot trust you with my classified assets. Your clearance is suspended pending a full formal review." He stood there, pale and shaking, realizing that the fake ID he mocked was the only reason he had a career at all. In the Navy, you can survive a bad mission. You can survive a bad evaluation. But you cannot survive pissing off the person who holds the keys to the kingdom. The fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely administrative. In the Navy, there is no phrase more terrifying than detached for cause. It means you haven't just lost your job, you have lost the confidence of the institution itself. Within 48 hours of our meeting in the conference room, Commander Holloway was removed from his ship. His clearance was suspended pending a psychological evaluation that I knew he would never pass, effectively flatlining a career he had spent 20 years building on bluster and intimidation. I didn't feel a surge of joy as I signed the final paperwork, nor did I feel guilty. I simply felt the cool, detached satisfaction of a mechanic removing a faulty part from a high-performance engine. But if the Navy's reaction was efficient, my mother's reaction was explosive. My phone rang 2 nights later, and the caller ID, Mom, flashed on the screen like a warning light. I stared at it for a long moment, the old knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. I knew that ringtone. It wasn't the ring of a mother calling to check on her daughter after a bad date. It was the ring of a manager calling to scold an unruly employee. When I finally answered, I didn't even get a hello. "Rick called me," she hissed, her voice trembling with a rage I hadn't heard since I refused to go to prom with her friend's son. "He said you got him fired. He said you made a scene at headquarters and impersonated an officer. How could you do this?" I closed my eyes and let out a long, slow breath. I thought about the years of silent endurance, the birthdays where she praised my brother's mediocrity while ignoring my promotions, the endless comments about my little computer job, the way she looked at me like I was a puzzle she had given up on solving. She was ready to believe a man she had met twice over her own daughter. She was ready to believe I was a criminal fraud rather than accept the possibility that I was successful. "He said you ruined a good man's life because you can't handle a strong personality," she continued, her voice rising to a shriek. "I set you up with a commander, and you act like a child." "Mom, stop," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had the steel of the boardroom in it, a tone she had never heard from me before. "No, I will not stop. You need to apologize to him. You need to fix this. I didn't impersonate anyone, Mom, I cut in, my words spacing out, slow and deliberate. I am the boss. Do you understand what that means? Rick wasn't fired because I threw a tantrum. He was fired because he put his hands on a superior officer. He was abusive, he was unstable, and I removed him from my Navy because that is my job. The silence on the other end was deafening. It was the sound of a worldview shattering. I am not a secretary, I continued, finally letting the wall come down. I am a director of intelligence. I make decisions that save lives. And Rick was a liability. I didn't ruin him. I exposed him. I took a breath, preparing to draw the hardest line of my life. And here is what is going to happen next. If you ever set me up with a man who disrespects me again, or if you ever question my rank again, you won't hear from me until I retire. I am done proving myself to you. I hung up before she could respond. I didn't block her number, but I archived the chat. The silence that followed wasn't lonely, it was peaceful. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet productivity. The atmosphere in my office shifted subtly but perceptibly. The whispers about the commander incident had circulated as I knew they would. But instead of gossip, I found a new, solidified layer of respect. When I walked into a briefing, the hush was immediate. Junior officers squared their shoulders a little more. Peers nodded with a knowing gravity. I wasn't just the smart analyst anymore. I was the one who had protected the house. I realized I didn't need a husband with a title to validate my existence. My validation was in the clearance codes on my desk, the respect of the admiral, and the safety of the fleet. Then came the mirror moment, the final punctuation mark on the entire saga. I was walking down the C-ring corridor of the Pentagon, flanked by two of my senior aides. We were discussing a logistics chain for the Pacific Theater, moving fast, our heels clicking in rhythm on the polished floor. Ahead of us, a man was pushing a mail cart, a task usually reserved for interns or those in administrative purgatory. It was Rick. He wasn't wearing his dress whites. He was in khakis, looking tired, gray, and significantly smaller than I remembered. He looked up as we approached, likely preparing to step into our path or make a comment. But then he saw me. He saw the way my aides deferred to me. He saw the badge catching the light. He didn't speak. He didn't sneer. He simply stopped the cart, pulled it tight against the wall, and lowered his eyes to the floor, making himself as small as possible to let me pass. He had finally learned his place. I didn't stop. I didn't gloat. I didn't even break my stride. I checked my watch, dismissed the memory of him like a closed file, and walked into my next meeting. My mother wanted me to marry a commander so I'd have someone to look up to. I decided to become the person the commanders look up to instead. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't realize you held all the cards? Or had family who refused to understand your success? Tell me your story in the comments. And if you enjoyed this reckoning, hit that like button.